The United States won World War II, but what they did right after makes you question everything you thought you knew about the good guys and bad guys. Because in 1945, while Nazi war criminals were being hunted down and put on trial, America was secretly smuggling over 1,000 of Hitler's top scientists into the country. And they didn't just give them jobs. They gave them new identities, erased their criminal records, and put them in charge of building the future of American military technology. This is the story they don't teach you in school. May 8th, 1945. Germany surrenders. The war in Europe is over. Allied forces are flooding into German territory, discovering the horrors of concentration camps and the full extent of Nazi atrocities. War crime tribunals are being planned. Justice is supposed to be served. But while some Nazis are being arrested, others are being offered something completely different. A one-way ticket to America, a fresh start, protection from prosecution. Why? Because they knew how to build rockets. And in the race against the Soviet Union that was just beginning, America decided that beating the Russians was more important than punishing war criminals. The operation was called Paperclip, and by the time it ended, it had brought over 1,600 German scientists, engineers, and technicians to American soil. Many of them had direct ties to the Nazi Party. Some had used slave labor. A few had even conducted experiments on concentration camp prisoners. This is how it happened, and why it still matters today. Let's go back to early 1945. The war isn't over yet, but everyone knows Germany is losing. American and British troops are pushing in from the west. The Soviets are storming in from the east. And both sides have realized something important. Germany might be losing the war, but they're winning the technology race. The V2 rocket. You've probably heard of it. It was the world's first long-range guided ballistic missile, Hitler's so-called wonder weapon. These things could fly over 200 miles, reach speeds of 3,500 miles per hour, and hit targets with terrifying accuracy. They were launched from mobile platforms, which made them almost impossible to stop. Between 1944 and 1945, Germany fired over 3,000 V2 rockets at Allied cities. London got hit with more than 1,400 of them. Thousands of people died. But here's what really scared Allied intelligence. The V2 wasn't just a weapon. It was a glimpse into the future. This was rocket technology that was decades ahead of anything America or Britain had. And the Germans had other projects too. Jet engines, guided missiles, even preliminary work on what would eventually become intercontinental ballistic missiles, the kind that could carry nuclear warheads across oceans. Now put yourself in the shoes of American military leaders in 1945. You've just spent 4 years fighting the deadliest war in human history. Over 400,000 American soldiers are dead. The country is exhausted. But you know another conflict is coming. The alliance with the Soviet Union was always temporary. Stalin's already making moves in Eastern Europe. The Cold War hasn't officially started yet, but everyone sees it coming. And you know that whoever gets the best German scientists first will have a massive advantage in the next conflict. So you have a choice. You can let the Soviets grab all the German talent, or you can get there first. Even if it means bringing Nazis to America, even if it means lying to the public, even if it means ignoring the fact that some of these men have blood on their hands. The Pentagon made their choice, and they called it Operation Overcast. That was the original name before they changed it to Paperclip. The mission was simple: get to Germany before the Soviets, find the scientists, bring them to America, no matter what it takes. The first teams arrived in Germany in spring 1945. They were called the Alsos Mission and the Combined Intelligence Objectives Subcommittee. Basically, these were groups of American and British intelligence officers whose job was to locate German scientists and secure Nazi research facilities before the Soviets could get to them. They had lists, hundreds of names, Physicists, chemists, rocket engineers, aviation experts, anyone who had worked on advanced German military projects, the teams would roll into recently captured cities, go straight to universities and research facilities, and start making offers. Come work for America. We'll protect you. We'll pay you. We'll get you and your family out of this destroyed country. A lot of the scientists said yes immediately. Germany was in ruins. The economy had collapsed. Food was scarce. The Soviet army was brutal in their occupation of Eastern Germany. And many of these scientists knew that if the Russians got to them first, they'd either be executed or forced to work in Soviet labor camps. America seemed like the better option, even if you had been a card-carrying Nazi party member, even if you'd done things during the war you weren't proud of. The star recruit was Wernher von Braun. If you don't know that name, you should, because this guy basically built the American space program. Von Braun was the lead engineer on the V2 rocket project. He was a member of the Nazi Party. He held the rank of Sturmbannführer in the SS, which is equivalent to a major. And he personally selected concentration camp prisoners to work as forced laborers in the underground factory where the V2 rockets were built. About 20,000 prisoners died building those rockets. That's more than the number of people killed by the rockets themselves. But von Braun was a genius, and American intelligence knew it. So in May 1945, von Braun and his entire team, over 100 German rocket engineers, surrendered to American forces. They didn't surrender to just any unit. They specifically sought out the Americans because they knew the US would treat them better than the Soviets would. Von Braun even had his team hide 14 tons of V2 rocket documents in an abandoned mine, which he then revealed to the Americans as a bargaining chip, basically saying, "We have all the research, take us and we'll give it to you." The Americans took the deal. Von Braun and his team were shipped to Fort Bliss in Texas. They were given contracts with the US Army, and within months they were rebuilding V2 rockets on American soil and training US soldiers how to use them. But there was a problem. Technically, this was illegal. The Yalta Conference and the Potsdam Agreement, which were treaties signed by the US, Britain, and the Soviet Union, specifically stated that Nazi Party members were supposed to be arrested and prosecuted for war crimes, not hired and given government jobs. President Truman had even issued an order saying that no one who had been more than a nominal participant in Nazi activities could be brought to America. So how did the military get around this? They lied. They created a program to sanitize the scientists' records. Intelligence officers would go through each scientist's file and remove or hide any evidence of Nazi Party membership, SS affiliation, or involvement in war crimes. They would literally take documents, classify them as secret, and create new fake backgrounds for these men. That's where the name Operation Paperclip comes from. When a scientist's file had been cleaned up, an officer would attach a paperclip to it. That was the signal that this person had been cleared for entry into the United States. Let me give you an example of how absurd this got. There was a scientist named Arthur Rudolph. He was the production director at the Mittelwerk underground factory, where the V2 rockets were built using slave labor. Concentration camp prisoners from Dora Mittelbau worked there in horrific conditions. They were beaten, starved, and worked to death. Rudolph was in charge of production. He knew what was happening. In fact, there's evidence he personally selected prisoners for execution if they were too sick or weak to work. After the war, US intelligence found all this out. They documented it, and then they buried it. They rewrote Rudolph's file to say he was not an ardent Nazi, and that his involvement in the party was purely for career reasons. They brought him to America. He worked for the US Army, then he worked for NASA. He became the project director for the Saturn V rocket, which put humans on the moon. NASA gave him awards. He was celebrated as an American hero. It wasn't until 1984 nearly 40 years later, that his past finally caught up with him. The Justice Department started investigating him, and rather than face trial, Rudolf fled back to Germany. But by then, the damage was done. He'd lived a comfortable life in America for decades, and he wasn't the only one. There was Hubertus Strughold, who became known as the father of space medicine in America. He'd conducted medical experiments on prisoners at Dachau concentration camp. There was Kurt Blome, who worked on biological weapons and conducted experiments on concentration camp prisoners. He was actually put on trial at Nuremberg, but he was acquitted due to lack of evidence. 2 months later, the US Army hired him to work on chemical warfare projects. There was Walter Schreiber, who was the German Army's chief of medical science. He oversaw experiments on prisoners. The Americans brought him over and gave him a job at the Air Force School of Medicine in Texas. When his past was exposed in the press, the military quietly moved him to Argentina instead. The craziest part is how many of them there were. The original plan was to bring over a few dozen of the most important scientists, but the program kept expanding. First, it was 100, then 500. By the time it officially ended in 1990, yes, 1990, the program had brought over 1,600 German scientists and engineers to America. Along with their families, that's over 10,000 people. They worked everywhere: NASA, the Department of Defense, private aerospace companies, universities. Some of them became American citizens. They bought houses in the suburbs. Their kids went to American schools. They became part of the community, and almost nobody knew who they really were or what they'd done during the war. The government kept it secret for decades. When journalists started asking questions in the 1960s and 70s, the military denied everything. They said it was Soviet propaganda. They said the scientists had been thoroughly vetted. They said none of them had committed war crimes. All lies. It wasn't until 1984 that the truth started coming out. That's when investigative journalist Linda Hunt published a series of articles exposing Operation Paperclip. She'd gotten access to declassified documents through the Freedom of Information Act. Her reporting revealed the full scope of the program and the fact that the government had knowingly brought war criminals to America and then covered it up. The public was shocked. There were calls for investigations. Some of the scientists were eventually deported or forced to resign. But by then, most of them were old men. Many had already died, and the contributions they'd made to American military and space technology couldn't be undone. So here's the big question. Was it worth it? Did Operation Paperclip actually help America win the Cold War? Or did the US compromise its moral authority for nothing? Let's start with what the scientists actually accomplished. Wernher von Braun and his team didn't just help America build rockets. They basically invented the modern space program. The Jupiter C rocket that launched America's first satellite, von Braun designed it. The Saturn V rocket that took Neil Armstrong to the moon, von Braun's team built it. NASA's Marshall Space Flight Center in Alabama, von Braun was the director. Without von Braun, there's a very real possibility that America loses the space race to the Soviet Union. The Soviets had their own German scientists from the Eastern occupation zone, but they didn't have anyone on von Braun's level. American achievements in space in the 1960s and 70s were directly built on German rocket technology from World War II, but it goes way beyond space. Operation Paperclip scientists worked on the development of ballistic missiles. They helped design the Redstone missile, which became the basis for America's nuclear arsenal. They worked on jet engine technology that revolutionized military aviation. They contributed to chemical and biological weapons research. They helped develop medical technology, including early work on aerospace medicine that's still used today. There's a direct line from Operation Paperclip to American dominance in the Cold War. The technology these scientists brought with them and the work they did in America gave the US a significant military advantage over the Soviet Union. Some historians argue that without Paperclip, the Cold War could have ended very differently. But here's the other side of the argument. What did America sacrifice to get that advantage? The United States built its identity on being the good guys in World War II. We fought the Nazis. We liberated the concentration camps. We held war crimes trials at Nuremberg, where we said very clearly that following orders is not an excuse for committing atrocities. Justice over revenge, the rule of law. These were supposed to be American values. And then we turned around and hired the very people who should have been standing trial. We gave them new lives. We gave them American citizenship. We gave them positions of authority and respect, and we lied about it. For decades, the government told the public that these men were clean, that they'd been carefully screened, that none of them had blood on their hands. All of that was false. Think about what that means for the survivors. Imagine you're a Holocaust survivor. You made it out of Dora Mittelbau concentration camp alive, even though thousands of your fellow prisoners died. You immigrated to America to start a new life, and then one day you turn on the TV and see the man who ran the factory where you were enslaved being celebrated as an American hero, getting awards from NASA, living a comfortable life in Alabama with a nice house and a good salary. How would that feel? This actually happened. There are documented cases of Holocaust survivors recognizing paperclip scientists years later and trying to bring them to justice. In most cases, nothing happened because the government protected the scientists. The official line was that these men were too important to prosecute. National security came first. So was it worth it? That depends on what you think is more important, winning a war or staying true to your principles. Some people say the Cold War was an existential threat and America had no choice. If we didn't take the Nazi scientists, the Soviets would have, and then we might have lost the Cold War. From that perspective, Operation Paperclip was a necessary evil, the right choice in a bad situation. Other people say there's no excuse. You don't beat evil by becoming evil. You don't fight for freedom and democracy and then turn around and protect war criminals. By bringing Nazis to America and lying about it, the US government set a precedent that it's okay to ignore the law when it's convenient, that some people are above justice if they're useful enough, that moral principles can be sacrificed for practical benefits. Both arguments have merit, but here's what we know for sure. The US government lied to the American people for 40 years about Operation Paperclip. When the truth finally came out, it damaged America's credibility. It gave ammunition to Soviet propaganda during the Cold War, and it hurt the survivors of Nazi atrocities who saw their tormentors rewarded instead of punished. There's also this question, did we actually need these scientists as badly as we thought we did? America had plenty of smart people. We had universities full of physicists and engineers. Yes, the Germans were ahead in rocket technology in 1945. But would American scientists have eventually figured it out on their own? Maybe it would have taken a few more years. But would that really have changed the outcome of the Cold War? We'll never know. Because the decision was made, and once von Braun and the others were embedded in the American military-industrial complex, there was no going back. The secret became bigger and more important to protect. Too many people's careers depended on keeping it quiet. Too much of America's technological success was built on their work. Let me tell you about some specific people so you understand exactly who we're talking about. Because when we say Nazi scientists, it's easy to picture some abstract group of nameless Germans in lab coats. But these were real people with real histories and real crimes. Kurt Debus. He was a German rocket scientist and member of the Nazi Party. He also happened to be a member of the SA, which were Hitler's stormtroopers. After the war, he was brought to America under Operation Paperclip. He worked at the Army Ballistic Missile Agency, then moved to NASA. He became the first director of Kennedy Space Center. He was in charge of launching Apollo 11, the mission that put the first humans on the moon. When Neil Armstrong took that one small step, Kurt Debus, former Nazi stormtrooper, was running the launch. Nobody mentioned that in the press coverage. Georg Ricke. He was the general manager at Mittelwerk, the underground factory where V-2 rockets were built by concentration camp slaves. He was supposed to stand trial at Nuremberg, but the charges were dropped. Why? Because American intelligence decided he was too useful. They brought him to America. He worked for the US Army Ordnance Corps. After a few years, he went back to Germany and had a successful career as an industrialist. He lived to age 88 and was never punished for his role in the deaths of thousands of prisoners. Walter Dornberger. He was a German general and the military commander of the V-2 rocket program. He was present at the underground factory. He knew about the slave labor. He knew prisoners were dying. After the war, Britain arrested him as a war criminal. He spent 2 years in a British prison. Then the US intervened and got him released. They brought him to America. He worked for the Air Force, then for Bell Aerospace. He consulted on military projects for decades. He died in 1980 at age 84, a free man who never faced trial, Otto Ambros. This one's particularly bad. He was a chemist who worked for IG Farben, the German chemical company. He helped develop Zyklon B, the poison gas used in the concentration camp gas chambers. He was also involved in experiments on prisoners at Auschwitz. After the war, he was actually convicted at Nuremberg. He was sentenced to 8 years in prison for crimes against humanity. He served 3 years. Then he was released early because of pressure from the US government, which wanted to consult with him on chemical weapons. He worked as an advisor for American companies and the Department of Energy. He was never brought back to justice. And then there's the medical people. This is where it gets really dark, because we're not just talking about rocket scientists who happen to be Nazis. We're talking about doctors who conducted experiments on human prisoners. Hubertus Strughold. I mentioned him earlier. He was an aviation medicine specialist. During the war, he was involved in experiments at Dachau, where prisoners were subjected to extreme cold, low pressure, and other conditions to test the limits of human survival. People died in these experiments. After the war, the US Air Force brought Strughold to America. He became the chief scientist at the Air Force School of Aviation Medicine. He helped develop the medical protocols that protected pilots and astronauts. NASA honored him with awards. The Air Force named their aerospace medicine library after him. It wasn't until 1993 that public pressure forced them to change the name. By then, Strughold had been dead for 7 years. Conrad Schaefer, another aviation medicine guy. He was involved in the seawater experiments at Dachau, where prisoners were forced to drink only seawater to test how long humans could survive without fresh water. Prisoners suffered horribly. Some died. Schaefer was supposed to stand trial at Nuremberg, but he was never indicted. Instead, the US brought him to Texas to work on similar research for the Air Force. He worked there for years before eventually returning to Germany. Walter Schreiber, I mentioned him too. He was the chief of medical science for the German army. He oversaw medical experiments on concentration camp prisoners, including deliberate infections with typhus and other diseases to test vaccines. After the war, the US hired him to work at the Air Force School of Medicine. When journalists exposed his background, there was public outrage. So the military quietly helped him escape to Argentina, where he lived out the rest of his life. These aren't isolated cases. These are just the ones we know about because their files were eventually declassified. There are hundreds of other paperclip scientists whose records are still partially classified. We don't know the full extent of what they did during the war. We don't know what the government knew about them when they were brought over, and we probably never will. Here's another thing that doesn't get talked about enough. Operation Paperclip didn't just bring the scientists, it brought their families too. Wives, children, sometimes extended family. That means the children of Nazi war criminals grew up as American citizens. They went to American schools. They had American friends. They probably had no idea what their fathers had done during the war because nobody talked about it. Think about the psychological impact of that, growing up as the child of someone who committed atrocities but not knowing it, or knowing it but being told to keep quiet because national security depends on your father's work. That's a burden no kid should have to carry, and it created this weird situation where there were probably neighborhood barbecues in Alabama in the 1960s, where former Nazi scientists and Holocaust survivors were both living in the same communities, shopping at the same stores, and nobody knew. The government had successfully buried the past so deep that even the people directly affected didn't know who was around them. There's also the question of what these scientists did with their knowledge after the war. We know they helped America build rockets and weapons, but did any of them feel remorse? Did they ever acknowledge what they'd done? Did they try to make amends? For the most part, no. Wernher von Braun, the most famous of the paperclip scientists, gave a few interviews later in life where he was asked about the slave labor at the V2 factory. His response was basically, "I was just a scientist focused on my work. I didn't know how bad the conditions were," which is absurd because he visited the factory regularly. He personally selected prisoners for the workforce. There's no way he didn't know, but that was the standard line. "I was just doing my job. I was just following orders. I didn't know." The same excuses that didn't work at Nuremberg somehow worked in America because these men were too useful to prosecute. Some of them even tried to rewrite history. Arthur Rudolph, the guy who ran the underground factory, wrote a memoir after he fled back to Germany. In it, he portrayed himself as a victim who was unfairly persecuted by the US government. He claimed he never mistreated prisoners and that the accusations against him were false. This from a man who literally had the power of life and death over thousands of concentration camp prisoners. So where does that leave us? Operation Paperclip ended officially in 1990, but its effects are still being felt today. The technology these scientists helped develop forms the foundation of modern American military and space capabilities. Every time a satellite goes into orbit, every time a ballistic missile is tested, there's a direct connection back to the work of German scientists who were brought over after World War II. But there's also a moral debt that has never been paid. The United States made a choice to prioritize winning over principles, to protect war criminals because they were useful, to lie to the public about it for decades. And when the truth finally came out, there were no real consequences. Some scientists were deported, but most kept their pensions and their reputations. Nobody went to jail. Nobody was held accountable. The survivors of Nazi atrocities got to watch their former captors live comfortable lives in America. That's not justice. That's not the America we're supposed to be. But it's what happened. And here's the thing that should bother you the most. If the government was willing to do this once, what's to stop them from doing it again? What's to stop them from making deals with bad people today if those people have something we want? How do we know it's not happening right now? We don't, because the whole point of programs like Operation Paperclip is that they're secret. By the time we find out about them, decades have passed and the people responsible are dead. That's not accountability. That's getting away with it. The lesson from Operation Paperclip isn't that America needed German scientists to win the Cold War. The lesson is that when governments operate in secret, when they decide that national security is more important than moral principles, Innocent people suffer and guilty people go free. The Holocaust survivors who recognized their tormentors on American TV deserved justice. The concentration camp prisoners who died building V-2 rockets deserved to have their deaths matter. The American public deserved to know the truth about who was being brought into the country. None of that happened. Instead, we got Wernher von Braun on the cover of magazines as the face of the space program. We got Arthur Rudolph receiving awards from NASA. We got Kurt Blome working on biological weapons for the very country that supposedly fought to stop the Nazis. And we got 40 years of lies from the government about all of it. Was the technology worth it? Maybe. Did it help America win the Cold War? Probably. But that's not the point. The point is that you can't claim moral superiority while protecting war criminals. You can't say you stand for justice while hiding the truth from the public. You can't be the good guys and do what Operation Paperclip did. Those things don't go together. And yet they happened. All of it happened. And most Americans still don't know the full story. They know Wernher von Braun's name because he's associated with NASA and the moon landing. They don't know he was an SS officer who used slave labor. They know America won the space race. They don't know how much of that victory was built on Nazi research. That's the real scandal of Operation Paperclip. Not just that it happened, but that it was covered up so successfully for so long that even now, most people don't know about it. And the people who do know tend to excuse it because, well, we beat the Soviets, didn't we? We made it to the moon first, didn't we? As if that makes everything else okay. It doesn't. Nothing about Operation Paperclip is okay. It was a betrayal of American values. It was a betrayal of the people who fought and died to defeat the Nazis. It was a betrayal of the Holocaust survivors who thought they were coming to a country that stood for justice. And it was a betrayal of the American public who trusted their government to tell them the truth. The fact that it helped us win the Cold War doesn't change any of that. If anything, it makes it worse, because it means we can't even say it was a pointless mistake. It worked. The immoral choice turned out to be the effective choice, and that's a much harder lesson to deal with. So the next time you see footage of a rocket launch, or you hear about American achievements in space, remember where it came from. Remember that some of the people who made it possible were the same people who built weapons of terror for Hitler. Remember that the government you trust to protect you once protected them instead. And ask yourself what else you don't know. Because if they could keep Operation Paperclip secret for 40 years, what else are they keeping from you right now? Subscribe if you want more history that challenges what you think you know.